we want to make sure that people are closing a learning loop. It's not enough to just have this insight. As we would say in coaching, it's about what are we doing to put it into practice and how are we learning from that ongoing circle of practice.
Hi, I'm Jennifer Britton, and welcome to the Coaching Many podcast. I've been on a mission for the last 20 years to expand the coaching conversation to many. Along with my co-host, Evana Valley, we're going to be exploring coaching as it relates to conversations, connection, and change in both personal and professional settings. Coaching Many is about creating empowering and thought-provoking spaces for conversation which strengthen relationships and enhance results. Throughout the Coaching Many podcast, we'll share tools, practices, and approaches to support you in your conversations, one dialogue at a time.
All right. Well, welcome back, everyone. I'm really excited for today's episode. First of all, how are you doing today, Evana?
I'm doing well. Besides a scratchy throat, all is awesome. And I'm excited to be here talking about a great topic with you.
Yeah. So today, if you haven't heard, if you haven't read the title, this is all about the experiential process in focus. So we really are going into the heart of learning. Coaching, along with other related modalities, have all evolved from similar stems or trunks of the learning tree. And I know for myself, as someone who was first trained as an experiential educator in the 1980s, then as a critical educator in the early 1990s to affect and partner with communities for social change, this is really at the heart of my work, of our work here at Potentials Realized, and I think by default, group coaching as well, because the work that we do as coaches is really to affect change on multiple levels, whether it's change of the individual, change of the system, change of the organization, change of the community, change of the world. And so I want to thank you in advance for listening in today and thinking about how the topics that we're touching on might spark some curiosity, might spark some, I knew that, I've learned that already, and maybe an opportunity to create new bridges into how you are approaching your conversations and where they're going, how you're structuring them even. So Evana, what's your connection with today's topic? When you hear the experiential process, what comes to mind for you?
For me, it's just really at the heart of what allows for transformation to happen. Participants, whether you're doing one-on-one or groups or teams, really are seeking change, wanting something different. Oftentimes they don't know what it is. And this application of experiential, this active energy that comes with this is at the core of coaching, is at the core of really, I'm going to say even connection and conversations to be had.
Mm-hmm. And so let's put some definitions on the table, right? Because this could be sort of a very conceptual piece, but actually experiential education is all about the experience. It's all about doing and having an experience. So going to Google, right? So this comes from Toronto Metropolitan University, right in my backyard, and an article from Kolb. Here is what David Kolb, he published the experiential learning theory, which states that, quote, learning is the process whereby knowledge is created through the transformation of experience. Knowledge results from the combination of grasping and transforming experience. That's Kolb 1984, page 41 of his research. And I have to say, as a young graduate student, maybe 6 to 8 years later than that, our whole graduate framework at the Faculty of Environmental Studies had to be grounded in Kolb's framework. We had to state what sort of learning lens did you come at your work from. So there are 4 lenses, right? We can have a concrete experience. We're going to do it. We can create a reflective observation, as Kolb talks about. So looking back, having that reflective practice that we're talking about so much in 2024 in the world of coaching. We can have abstract conceptualization, and that's making sense of the experience through concepts and like theories And then we also have active experimentation, testing out your conclusions, developing a plan of action. So as you think about that, really, many of us talk about this. And in my work for years, I brought it forward as the what, so now what of group and team coaching.
Mm.
How are you helping your groups and teams move through that filter and the journey of exploration, of thinking about what have we done? What really happened? So what's important about this? How do we reflect? How do we tease out the learning? And now what are we going to do about it? So that's what we're going to be talking about in today's entire episode. And of course, there are many more layers than this, but at the core, this is what Cole posited back in the 80s. And really, as you think about where coaching was emerging at the same time, along with critical education, social activism, certainly a lot around process facilitation even, we all have the same roots, yet there are these very distinct nuances that each of our subdisciplines brings. And we'll go into that in future episodes. But today we want to zoom into the roots of the learning tree. So over to you. What's getting activated by my definition sharing so far, Evana?
Yeah, what's getting activated is like in a group coaching context, like what does that look like to actually allow the space for the experience and that reflection and then that abstract, right? Like to me, it's like intentionality, design. How do I actually activate this? Like in practicum and even in my own growth journey for that matter, like you see that evolution of coaches when they're actually integrating the learning of our best practices. Oftentimes it's like they're embodying these things for real time. Because coaching is not just mere questions. It is powerful questions, but how do those powerful questions connect and relate to what we're actually stand for and what our participants want for themselves in the topic of the conversation? And so I think this model, this experiential learning, is just so fundamental. It's so fundamental, and it actually simplifies the design if you really come with it from this standpoint. Now, what I love about the work that, your intellectual property, Jennifer, in terms of how do we do what and when so we can expand that conversation, because as coaches, we really want to allow our participants to have that space, to have that pause.
Yeah.
And so how do we design our sessions? So we can bring in the topic and be able to go into the reflection? Are we doing that assessment in the conversation, or can we do it as pre-work so it can allow that shift of perspective, that inner work? Like a lot of the work that I do really is to support women, whether they're in whatever transition. This is relevant for anyone in change for that matter, is really, how do I slow down enough to actually notice what I'm doing and notice the things that I'm doing? And if those things are actually serving my goals, supporting me to work towards my goals. And this model of learning really supports that self-discovery and supports that inner resiliency, but also supports people to make those empowered choices, which is really the circle of those 4 steps. So that's what's being activated for me. There's so much.
Well, and again, so the 4 steps, if some listeners are probably going, what are the 4 steps? So ERGA is the frame that we often talk about, E standing for experience. What did you do? And let's imagine you're a new leader and you're going through change with your team, right? The team is newly forming. So what is happening? What are we noticing behaviorally? What are we seeing, right? We want to go back to like, what are we seeing through the lens of a camera, especially in workspaces that are changing, or global workspaces where we may not see each other all the time. The next component is the R, the reflection, right? And this is the critical piece. So in a group process, what are you doing to help people pause and reflect? How are they getting the opportunity real time in the conversation to stop, to pause? I have to say, one thing I've noticed in my work as a practitioner, especially working with entrepreneurial groups a lot this last year, seeing how people really value what I call reflective prompts. So we might spend 10 to even 20 minutes moving through a series of reflective prompts, and people are invited to write it down, sketch it out, just simply pause and think and be with the question. That's what people love. And then we open it up for discussion because people have done the reflection. They've thought about so what really happened? What did I notice? So if we go back to the leadership example, right, on a team, what is the team noticing? Like, so what happens every time we cut so-and-so off in the meeting? Or what happens every time we deviate from the agenda that we've said we really want to be moving towards, but we keep throwing it out the window? The so what is where the learning really starts to percolate. It's that reflective space.
What I'm hearing too is like, as coaches, we really need to be mindful and sensitive to like, what is the needs of the group? And a lot of coaches, a lot of leaders or a lot of entrepreneurs, whoever you're coaching, really, we're natural doers, we're producers, we're actors, like we act. And so part of the dynamic, the genius of our work is to create those moments of pause through those reflective prompts, whatever that is, to allow the human, the participant, the team to slow down and actually pause and see what's so.
Yes. As I come out of the screen for a moment, only to grab my bag, right? Because some people be like, oh, but I don't have time to do a reflective prompt. Well, listen, then you bring in the cards. If people don't want to sit with their thoughts, because there are groups that's not active enough, right? You bring in your card deck. So I thought here today, some of the 90-day guide cards, which again, love that I can just put them in the tin, pull them out. Interestingly enough, here is day 29. Your beliefs become your thoughts. Your thoughts become your words become your actions become your habits become your values become your destiny. Of course, that's Gandhi, right? But there's a connection to what we're thinking about. How do you create the reflective space to help people think about, what am I thinking about? And how is that thought translating into words, translating into action, translating into all of these ripples? So ERGA is not
inaction, right? Like, do I mean, like, or the opposite? How can you create that space so people can actually go, oh, I'm saying I want this, but the things that I'm actually realizing, my beliefs, my thoughts, etc., are actually counterintuitive to what I'm actually wanting. That comes in the moment of pause, in the moment of reflection, in the moment of what are the things that I'm doing and how does that relate to what's important to me?
Yeah. And so how do we activate? The question truly is, how do we activate that curiosity and that insight and in a pause, right? It may be a question. It may be pick a card. It may be pick a charm. Take a look at this. What's, like, go to your gut. So invitation for coaches listening in right now, what do you have available to you in terms of looking at the reflective space? Otto Schein, again, is also his theory U, right, is pretty well known. It's a newer theory, right, from the 2000s. So if we're jumping ahead, a lot of critical facilitators use and make reference to theory U, as do coaching supervisors. So I think there's more opportunity as well to think about what branches of the trees do you see yourself growing into or evolving into, because all of this comes to the same trunk, right? If we really bring it down to experiential process. And I know when I was introduced to Otto Schein's work, I was like, wow, this is so interesting. It made me think about this 1970s work of Paulo Freire, who is a critical educator in Latin America. And his work, Pedagogy of the Oppressed, is very powerful, even 50 years later, about how do we really affect social change? How do we use a lot of what we're talking about, right, in terms of activating change and activating people in the change process? So, learning, this is not just about learning. This really is about change. And I think that's how we started today's episode, really getting people to think about, what do you have as a coach? How do you approach the process of change? And we've got to start with people's experience, right? Like I am me and I am bringing this to the table. So as we experience and reflect, then we want to generalize. We need to think about, how is this showing up in different ways? And I'm curious if in your rooms, Evana, you're seeing people, it's like the dominoes. I sort of use the metaphor of the dominoes. They have one insight and it's like, ooh, it now sets off this chain reaction where people can start seeing how this belief system, I liked your example of using a belief system, right? This belief system is actually showing up not only at work, not only in this team conversation, but in other projects, in the relationship with your spouse or loved ones, in your parenting, maybe in the way you approach your neighbors. Like it's really, it's dominoes. It really can be all of these, like the firecrackers that are connected. Like it's like, right? You just start seeing the lights go off, which is, as an educator, that is power. That is truly power.
Absolutely. It shows up very much in the conversations I have, in the diverse conversations I have, because there's even a great quote. It's like, how you do one thing is how you do everything. And so when we are supporting our participants to like kind of identify possible blind spots, I'm going to say, like when you know better, you do better. So it's like, we're really trying to make the unconscious or subconscious conscious.
Yeah.
And so once we've done that, then we can go, oh, okay, so this is how you're doing this area, this transition of your life is you're actually continuing to look outwardly. A lot of the women that I work with are just natural givers, but you might give them the label of people pleasers, but they're generous, they're kind. And so they're in this relationship transition and they don't know who they are and they don't know what to do with themselves. And they're very uncomfortable with solitude. And so part of the work that I do and integrating this model is allowing them the space to have some solitude, the gift of solitude, but have them really connect to what is going on inside of them. So that way they can identify, oh, wow, like I actually have a really hard time just being with me. Oh, wow, I have a really hard time saying no to others. And yet it leaves me depleted. So they start to unmask how these things that we just take for granted are actually having a ripple effect. And how oftentimes many of the women that I work with have had a relationship transition and they jump into another relationship just to continue to be hurt, just to be able, just to continue attracting the wrong type. Why? Because they haven't taken time for themselves. And so even if you think about this model, the generalized, you aren't comfortable with having time to yourself. Doesn't mean you have to sit and not do anything, but even going out in nature and taking a walk on your own or just having a coffee. When I was single for many years, they were like, you go to the movies on your own? I've always gone to the movies on my own. Why? Because I love the movies.
Exactly.
Someone, whether I'm with someone or not, is not going to change it, right? But it's in that self-discovery through this model that each participant, more general now, each participant gets to discover for themselves what's actually supporting them and what's actually getting in the way, in the general way of how they're living and making their choices or not making their choices. So it's super powerful and impactful for that self-discovery, because this I remember as a new coach, I'll just say this, I remember, I'll be really, really transparent here. I went into coaching because all I was doing was solving people's problems. And so I thought, if that's all I'm doing, why not get paid for it? Well, little did I know in my fundamentals of CTI, oh, hold on, I'm up for a real game. I'm up for my own transformation, because we're not here to tell people what to do, or else the change is not going to happen. It's not going to last. Our container as coaches is to support the environment, to create the nurturing environment using ERGA, the what, so what, now what, for people to have their own self-discoveries for themselves. And then that leads them to the A, which
which is application. And I'm going to, before we go to the A, I want to flash back though to the E. I want to go right back to the beginning, because it is, you said something really important of the experience, right? I think in today's busy world, we aren't even slowing down to assess what really happened, right? And it's not about going back. It's not about rehashing, but, experiential learning at its heart is about being an active participant in the world. it may be the world, it might be your life, it might be the nature, it might be the business setting, but it's like we are an active participant in the process. And so I think that has tangents to many of the things that we've talked about. So presence, right? How are we showing up? Not only as coach, but how are our clients showing up in the experience? My own roots go back to, and again, late 80s. So this is just a few years like after, but in my youth leadership development, I would take people out into the park, out into one of our provincial parks. We go into nature, right? And this is really where it was outdoor education, which is where experiential really found its roots. And so how could you, whether it was doing an outward bound, whether it was using other practices for me, in the jungles of South America, really like, what are you learning and experiencing in every moment? When the volcano goes off 45 minutes away, every 45 minutes in the middle of Costa Rica, what does that have as an impact on you as a human and where you're going to go? And so really we use the experience every time to really mine it. And I do want to talk a lot about the Spiral Lighthouse Coach. The Spiral Lighthouse Coach is coming from this foundation of experiential education, because every time we have that experience, it's going to be different. But are we recognizing that it's different?
Yeah.
We're looking out the window of that spiral staircase and seeing something slightly different. So Evana, really, I like what you did in helping us see it through the lens of coaching. And I want to take us back out again to that 30,000 foot view of like, truly this, even though experiential processes are in all shapes and forms in the workplace, in the formal education sector, we also want to sometimes challenge how are we creating experiences? One of the biggest pain points right now, no surprise, and we've been seeing this now for 5 or more years, is meetings. The hue and cry, let's bring people back to the office so they can collaborate. But they're not collaborating, right? They're not having experiences. They're not creating shared experiences, let alone pausing to reflect and pivot and learn and change. And so again, I sort of want to use today's episode as a bit of a like, what needs shaking up? Like, are you really integrating this whole ERGA model? It is a model of change. And if you are on the pathway to change in an organization right now, how are you activating this in everything you do? Even in a meeting landscape, you can sort of embed these micro ERGA models. Because if we're not learning from what we're doing, then what's the point? And that is the educator in me speaking. Truly, the world has to keep changing. The world is continuing to change. So how are we working with that? So
you're saying something that I think is probably pretty, not what you're saying, but it activated something in me when I was working in corporate and really in the project management world. When we go through all the stages of a project, and then the project would come to close. And this would be when we would be doing our postmortem or lessons learned. And oftentimes that would just be bypassed, skipped.
Yeah, totally.
Which is the fundamental, like to really close
why we do
that
those
loop.
postmortems, right? It was the original idea, but yet, decades later, of course you do a postmortem, but do people realize why we do a postmortem?
Yeah.
Like truly, it is critical, absolutely critical. So here's what we want to do is make sure that we close the loop, right? It's about application. And truly, this is why I came to coaching, right? I was doing experiential for 2 decades before I became a coach. Really, it's about now what? It's what are we going to do? And so truly, we want to make sure that people are closing the learning loop. It's not enough to just have this insight. As we would say in coaching, it's about what are we doing to put it into practice? And how are we learning from that ongoing circle of practice? So application is commitments. It's the to-dos and the to-bes. We're not just doing, we're also being. And I think as we've shared in other episodes, and you can look up at our Evoking Awareness episode, what are we doing to help people with application of new mindset, new belief systems? It's not just new to-dos. It's got to really be whole person. And I keep looking down at my phone because here's another layer I want to put on, not to muddy the waters, but I think as we think about application, three educational researchers, Lee Anderson, David Bood, and Ruth Cohen, who you may have heard about, they created criteria that helps us understand if a project is truly experiential. Here are the criteria. One, it has to be personally meaningful goal. Well, isn't that what we do with coaching, right? Two, it has to personally engage the person and involve the whole person in the learning experience, including their senses, their emotions, and their personalities. So with that, what are we doing in the application process? Are we helping people not just think it, but embody it? Are we really getting to that layer of embodiment that we've touched on in so many other episodes? And again, I think as coaches, this is where we're naturally called to really help clients create structures, as we would call it in the coaching world, to then affect their change, sustainable change, not just, I'm going to do it once. But the beauty of working with a coach is I'm going to keep on doing it, right? Like my coach is going to check in and say, hey, how's that new practice of getting up early or cutting out the garbage in a meeting process? It's a pretty strong statement, but that's what we do. We hold the space for accountability. And if you haven't listened to our episode on accountability, I really invite you to do that, because this, again, is a differentiator. Part of our mandate as coaches is to hold that co-created container and to make sure that the coaching arc gets to accountability. As a process facilitator, I've been one for many, many decades. I don't have the same orientation. All I need to do is ask, what are you going to do? But as a coach, I'm not only asking, what do you need to do and how you're going to do it? How are you going to embody this? And hey, I'm going to be checking in with you, or we're going to look at how you want to be held accountable around that.
Yeah. I want to add to this final piece of application or action, because I love what you said. And two things. Another word that came to me was integrate. So through that whole process, how are we supporting the integration of what was discovered through that reflection? How are we helping the integration from that reflection to the generalization, how it's affecting others? And then how are we supporting, ultimately with accountability, for people to make those intentional choices? This goes back to intentionality at the heart of this, right? To me, it's really about that. Like, this last step is fundamental. It's also been a growth edge, because I've been a doer. But now it's really, okay, but hold on, what is important about this? And what is that commitment I'm going to make? But it needs to come back to your intentionality, which is your goals and your vision. When you help people connect back to their vision, especially in times of difficulty, in times of change, in times of resistance, helping people connect back to their goals and their vision and integrate what they've discovered now as it relates to those things, magic happens. And as the coach, just to double down on what you said, that's where you as the coach really come in and go, okay, and so what are you going to do? And what am I going to do to support you in doing it? Like, how can I support your success? This isn't me telling you what to do. This is me empowering you through this process to get you where you want to go, and me believing in you in those moments of difficulty, me reminding you in bringing in your vision, your values, whatever it is, to keep you going in the goal and the direction of what you want in your life and what you want in the world, for that matter.
Yeah. And again, back to that comment earlier, it's got to have meaning, right? Experiential processes are all about the learner as the center of the stage. And so that is where we come from as coaches. So practically, let's spend a couple of minutes, not very long, but my invite is for each of you to think about, what tools do you have at each stage? E, experience; R, reflection; G, generalization; and A, application. I think there's a useful thinking and perhaps peer conversation here for you to think about, what tools, what practices, what questions do I ask at each stage of the learning cycle? I think you mentioned it earlier, Ivana, right? Like good design, right? Back to design. It's like great design incorporates ERGA and the experiential process in the backdrop of every group and team coaching conversation that we activate, because we don't know where it's going to go, right? Like it is not us to direct it, but we can direct the process and make sure that we are embedding the what, so what, now what throughout the coaching conversation.
Absolutely. Yeah, absolutely. It's again, it's going back to that role and that stance of who we are as coaches and where we come into the conversation and where we fade out. At what point do we fade out and what is that? And I really appreciate what you said, Jen, about that, because it is important that we as the coach really take that stand and are very clear and support our participants to really get clear on the meaning about what we're doing. So that way we can really support them. What is important about this to you? What is meaningful about this to you? I think is key.
Yeah. So great connection here, purpose, the why, vision, values, our manifestos as a human as well. So I think today's episode has really hopefully provoked a lot of thinking, maybe also connected some dots. We'd love to hear from you. And whether you're watching this on YouTube, you're listening in your favorite podcast player, we want to keep the conversation going. So as we move into, you might be listening to this towards year end or maybe at the beginning of a new year, connect in, right? Connect in with us at groupcoachingessentials.ca. Connect into our community. We're going to be resuming our community calls on a regular basis. And as we get to year end, there'll be vision work sessions. I hope that you'll drop into that, because you're not alone. And I think that is part of this work, is you are not alone. And it's really important that when we create moments for shared experience, right, there's dual layers of learning. There's the individual layer of my ERGA process, but then there's the collective layer of what I'm learning with and from my peers. And so we didn't even touch on that today, but just I hope that you hear that in this work, it's not just about the individual, it is about the collective as well. So with that, I think it's actually time for me to head to my collective. The Muskoka Collective is calling. I'm going to be working out of there this morning, later today. Got to jump in my car, but want to leave you with just, the thinking of the what, the so what, the now what, and what are the experiences you are finding yourself in the process of life. As change agents, we can always make a change. And sometimes that is just changing location. And so if you do have that opportunity, what are you noticing next time you're in a different space coaching? What do you see? What's available to you? So I'll leave that as an inquiry and a seed for a future episode. What do you want to leave our listeners with today, Evana?
Yeah, I want to leave you with the fact that, you have many tools and resources that you're already using. And so take an inventory of those and how you can apply the what, so what, now what. And also consider other tools to make that to activate that conversation. I'm just thinking about the charms that I use in one-on-one coaching, and I also use in groups. Like what are other tools to really support and activate that deeper learning, that experiential, hands touching or heart-centered, body somatics for that matter, what it is that you have access to really expand and activate that what, so what, now what. That's my challenge to you. It's how can you expand and stretch your growth, but also expand that transformation in your participants through tools that you have and tools that you have access to.
Wonderful. Well, as always, I've enjoyed our time. Be well, everyone, and we'll see you for our next episode. Take care.
Take care. Ciao.